I would say a lot of it depends on the business, but my personal kind of viewpoint on this is decentralized. I have found is generally much more adaptable and agile for the organization because then, and like I talked about from my previous experience, is that when I'm kind of farming my team out to work on various projects, a lot of those projects I did not have direct control over. So I'm aware of what they're working on. I'm having, I have a relationship with the manager or the project owner with regards to what they're working on, so I can give my team feedback. But they're now responding at the pace of what it is that that project is now pursuing on. So now they get to adapt more quickly and deliver results. And because of that, they're getting much more positive feedback and they're building up that relationship, that business relationship that you talked about earlier. That's so important. And I have found that to be very valuable. I had to kind of put my ego aside in terms of that assistant director mindset and just say, this is what's best for the business and it's what's best for my team members because they're growing into skills that I might necessarily not have thought of if I were trying to lead that project for them towards a proposed solution. They're coming up with their own solutions based on that feedback from the team. So I think the business of the future of learning and development, there may be some centralized function with regards to core values and organizational message and things like that. But then I also think there's a benefit to the decentralization at some point where those teams that work with divisions understanding their business needs and directly working with
Welcome to the LearnOps Leadership Series. Today I'm really excited to be hosting Joe Dunlap. Joe has over 15 years of experience in L&D. Throughout those 15 years, he's been focused on transformational continuous learning, performance improvement, diversity, skills and competency development, social collaborative learning, cross-disciplinary learning teams, as well as tech and analytics. Joe was previously L&D at Toppers and is currently with CJK Group. Joe, welcome.
Thank you, Ryan. It's great to be here.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Ryan.
Well, we always kick off the show, Joe, just by learning about people's stories and how they even got into L&D. We usually see that people fall into L&D, and it's such a great journey. We'd love to learn how you got started, if you're willing to share your story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am one of those people who fell into L&D. So when I finished graduate school, my plan was to be in human resource management, and I did that for a couple years. But because at that time, human resources management incorporated organizational development, learning development, all those functions that are now generally separate, I got the experience of doing some L&D for the different organizations and universities that I was working for at the time, and just really grew fond of it, learned a great deal more about it as I went along, and eventually it became my profession. And since then, I've never looked back. I've always enjoyed the learning and development space, and considering where we are now with a lot of the digital transformation that's occurring, and certainly the constant change within businesses, it's just a great time to be in learning and development.
I agree, and I want to just hone back on something that you said, how you started more on the HR side of things and fell into learning, and you mentioned something really important. They're separate now, right? There's this connotation, L&D, learning and development, is very esoteric. So if you don't come from the industry, you usually don't really understand the function or how it operates. And we still hear this quite a bit right now. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that transformation on where it's separated, when, and why that is important in your opinion.
Yeah, so for me, and I was working, and this is probably in the late 90s, early 2000s, I was working for a very large organization, and HR was the umbrella, and there were those separate units. There was learning development, there was org development, employee relations and engagement, things like that, but we all kind of fell under the HR umbrella. But really, because of the organization size and what was occurring in a lot of other organizations at that time, especially of similar or larger, was the separation. Because certainly I think the executive teams of those organizations, certainly our executive team, recognized that they had their own specific purpose. They need to have their own specific vision and their own work. And more importantly, it shouldn't be influenced by another organization, as you just said, who didn't quite understand the nuances of that type of work, And certainly, as you're probably aware, certainly at that time, and I still see it today, that a lot of people think of learning and development as education. And that really is what kind of hurts us, because it's really not education. It's much more focused on performance and training than it is that educational mindset.
Yeah, no, that's really important. And, a story to share. We have a customer who, in their L&D function, of 100 people actually reported into HR. This is recently. And out of nowhere, it got moved under a senior vice president of operations, right?
Oh,
And
wow.
so I think that that's really interesting to to really, and a strong statement to show that learning and development is becoming very performance and strategic to the business. And it really requires that business mindset to know how to leverage that effectively. It's similar to, reminds me similar to like 10 or more years ago when engineering teams kind of reported into IT, and now they're their own separate thing. There's a lot of concepts to learn from product management functions when it relates to learning and development. What are your thoughts on why that transformation is happening even to this day now? I mean, this story is very recent, as of last week. You know, what do you think has happened to learning and development post pandemic, where businesses are waking up and saying, maybe this shouldn't be tied to HR so much?
Yeah, so I actually saw some of this transformation occurring before the pandemic. And then certainly there's the post pandemic and what kind of escalated that. And so I think the implementation of some different methodologies like design thinking, agile, and lean startup, at least from my personal experience and people that I'm connected to in my network, that's where we start to see that transformation. So now you, as that person in learning development, are now working on some of these agile or lean startup teams. So you're kind of removed from your environment of just being an L&D function. So you're understanding the methods, the process, the technologies, and the pace of that group who's now developing that product or service for that organization. So you're moving away from that idea of I'm going to build a course or I'm going to have an instructor-led event or something to that effect. Now I need to deliver something very quickly at the pace of the group I'm working with. And as part of that process, at least especially for me, I'm now learning the way that they're working. I'm understanding their terminology, their technology, and what's driving them, which is now what's driving me, because I'm trying to support those teams as I'm doing it. Post pandemic, certainly now you hear it all the time, skills, right? So everybody's talking about skills, and it kind of ruffles my feathers, so to speak, a little bit, because I think what we're really talking about is competency. I've never had a CEO who really cared so much about skills as it regards to performance. So when we talk about competencies, that's the performance, and that's the results that the most CEOs are looking for. So the skills leads into that competencies. It's part of that bigger dialogue with regards to behaviors and traits and things like that. And certainly since post-pandemic and the way that business has changed and work from home and things like that, you've seen that transformation of now how are we now focusing on not only those competencies that we need today, but we need to look 3-4 years down the line of what are those competencies that we have to build for tomorrow to remain competitive.
Yeah, I love that you just said that as well. I mean, something that we're very focused on is tying L&D interventions back to corporate strategy or 2 to 3 year outlooks for companies, 5-year outlooks, right? So usually if you're a company, you're working for a company that has a growth mindset and they want to go from A to Z in a certain amount of time, you're going to have to level up, right? And to get there, you do need to develop those competency pathways, roadmaps, and think through the skills that are going to help to get there. And so something we've been thinking about is like, how do you tie your learning initiatives back to those strategic objectives? So, you can point back, well, this thing that we spent money on, it's going to tie to this outcome for the business. Well, speaking of that, I mean, and especially, to expand on some of the thought processes that you talked about before, from an operational perspective, where do you see the L&D function playing that role into business strategy, into performance improvement?
And it kind of varies, and I'm lucky that I've had the experience of working for a technology organization. I've worked in manufacturing. I've certainly worked in hospitality as well. And so a lot of it may depend upon, again, who's your end customer? What are you actually developing? Are you developing a product or a service? But um, what at least I'm seeing right now, especially in my network of people that I'm associated with in LinkedIn, is that change of mindset away from the course or the workshop or things like that to now how are we delivering quicker, that now ties in, like you said, to the strategic results. And ironically, it's right there in front of us is those performance results that the organization expects. So when you're working with that group, that department, that team, whoever it may be, they have performance results that they're accountable to. And so you kind of have the measures right in front of you that how the work that that team is doing or that department or division, what's this associated with from a strategic standpoint. So now you can actually tie in what you're doing to their actual performance results, but then has that connection to that overall strategic objective. And and I hate to sound lazy because this will, but now that ROI and that other measurement work has been done for you because that team, that department division, had already has those measures. So you're now tying into those measures with regards to your actual output of what you produced that has now led to that strategic alignment.
I mean, I think it's not laziness, it's working smarter, not harder, right? I mean, to your point, there's teams of people focused on these strategic objectives, and
Yeah.
like any business function, L&D should be thinking about how do we align to that. How do
Yes.
we support it in a midterm, long-term perspective, but also how do we partner with internal departments or have these partnerships to unlock performance objectives from a bottoms-up perspective at the same time. So I mean, again, I love that you brought that up.
And if I may, I love what you just said, that partnership. And that's a key piece, Ryan, because it changes our focus. And certainly I was guilty of this in my past of being that person who received the I want requester, right? So I've got
Yeah.
that leader who comes to me that says, I want a course, I want a workshop, I want this. And like you just said, now it's about us going to them and developing that relationship and understanding their business and what their products or services that they're trying to produce are, what's driving them to now produce better learning resources for them for that moment of need. So I'm glad that you said that.
No, that makes a lot of sense as well. I mean, we hear that a lot. How do you prioritize? How do you push back? How can you score things? And actually, if you tie initiatives back to the business impact, right? So everybody talks about impact, but if you can actually create those linkages, which it doesn't have to be so hard, right? Here's our corporate objectives. Here are the competencies, skills that are required to get us from A to Z. This initiative we're working on ties to that. This one that you're requesting doesn't, right? And so it's really easy to say no if there isn't an immediate business outcome tied back to that business objective coming from the CEO.
Absolutely. Yep.
But you also want to, have those partnerships, and sometimes things aren't strategically driven. Maybe it's a short-term objective as well. What do you find the balance to be? How does L&D make up, any tips or tricks on or rules of engagement to have enough capacity to balance the two?
Yeah. So one of the things that actually I was very fortunate of in an organization that I was with about 8 years ago is they implemented that agile mindset that I talked about and the agile practices. And what it allowed me as an assistant director at that time to do is allow my team to make a decision on what kind of capacity they had to work on a project. So you can imagine that I have that person who comes to me that says, I need to develop something, whatever that may be. It's a workshop, it's a course, it's whatever that resource is. I can then turn to my team and say, okay, who has time during this frame, this period that this person's requesting this work from, to work on this. And they could turn around and say, you know what, I have 5 hours a week, or I have 2 hours a week, or whatever else. And so you get to have that honest dialogue with that leader saying, here's what we have the capacity to do for you. So we're going to change that mindset in regards to the output you want, and let's start doing something. Maybe that's just a micro video, maybe it's an interactive PDF, whatever it may be, that starts moving the needle on the performance or the output that you want. And so you start to see them say, okay, well, I can get some action with regards to what I'm trying to do even though it may not be the ideal situation that I walked into the department with regards to my request. And what I found, and I've used this analogy a couple of times, is that very often that I want requester wants the car. And we would take 6 to 9 months to develop a car. I spent the first half of my career developing that car for those leaders. Now we might develop first a skateboard and then a scooter and then a bicycle. And what I found over the past 9 years is very often we get to that bicycle or that motorbike in terms of our development, and that leader says, "Good enough. We've made the performance improvement we want. I don't need the car anymore." And so now we've increased our capacity because we're working on other projects at that same time. We're not putting all our resources and effort into developing a car that's not actually necessary.
Yeah, that makes sense too. And a lot of the times, if you take more of that iterative mindset versus let's perfect it from the start, there's a
Right.
lot of learnings, in between those stages, and feedback loops, right? And
Absolutely.
so if you try and take a waterfall approach to just trying to perfect it from day one, the only thing that's guaranteed is that you're going to be wrong. I
mean, you're absolutely right.
There's just too much learning to do along the way, right?
You're
and
right.
You need that time to make those quick adjustments, those quick pivots, based off of those learnings. A lot of times your stakeholders might not even know exactly what they want until you're halfway through the process, and they start figuring it out as you partner with them and collaborate.
You're absolutely right.
So in regards to, you mentioned you saw some of these transformations pre-pandemic.
Yes.
Where, given that, where do you see L&D teams structured differently today than in the past? I mean, we hear things, going from centralized to federated to decentralized. Is there a magic operating model, or does it depend on the business, in your opinion?
I would say a lot of it depends on the business, but my personal kind of viewpoint on this is decentralized. I have found is generally much more adaptable and agile for the organization, because then, and like I talked about from my previous experience, is that when I'm kind of farming my team out to work on various projects, a lot of those projects I did not have direct control over. So I'm aware of what they're working on. I'm having, I have a relationship with the manager or the project owner with regards to what they're working on, so I can give my team feedback. But they're now responding at the pace of what it is that that project is now pursuing on. So now they get to adapt more quickly and deliver results. And because of that, they're getting much more positive feedback, and they're building up that relationship, that business relationship that you talked about earlier, that's so important. And I have found that to be very valuable. I had to kind of put my ego aside in terms of that assistant director mindset and just say, this is what's best for the business, and it's what's best for my team members, because they're growing into skills that I might necessarily not have thought of if I were trying to lead that project for them towards a proposed solution. They're coming up with their own solutions based on that feedback that they're getting with the team. So I think the business of the future of learning and development, there may be some centralized function with regards to core values and organizational message and things like that. But then I also think there's a benefit to the decentralization at some point, where you get to now work with those teams, those departments, those divisions, understanding their business needs and directly working with them, being driven by those strategic objectives.
That makes sense too. And so in that regard, with with those partnerships and coming from that associate director kind of mindset, putting ego aside, etc., which I think is really wise. What about governance, and visibility? What did you set up in order to have visibility, have some governance or controls into quality, or making sure they're focused on the right things from an L&D perspective?
Yeah, so there could be, you could set up some certain measures. So if you wanted to make sure that, for instance, we followed certain principles of learning and development, good practice, you wanted to make sure that certain measures were being hit, then you could, to your team, say, okay, I want to see one or two of these things in every project that you do. And that could be any number of things. And what I have found that works is giving them the choice of, I want to see some type of financial measure, performance measure in this. I want to see that there's a continuous learning effort on this. It's not a one and done, as an example of that. So there are ways in which you can set certain controls and give your team the freedom to then start making the right choices based on sort of that menu of options that you're giving them of the governance control that works best for the project that they're working on. So therefore, you're not tying people into a box, so to speak. And I'll give you a great example. I heard this a couple of years ago. I was working with a client. I'm sitting in a meeting with the manager of learning development and her team. And one of the instructional designers was talking about a project that she had just started. And so she's describing the scope of the project, whatever else. And the manager at that moment said, well, I want sound instructional design on this. And so there's this moment where most people, and certainly I in my previous life, would have just, okay, yeah, and we're moving along. But what happened was that she actually put that instructional designer in a box and said, you're developing a course. By making that statement. So she took away all other possible options from that instructional designer by saying, I want sound instructional design on that course. And so you've already handicapped or handcuffed that individual from producing what might be a better solution that might be much more suitable for that particular product, and something like we talked about earlier, where maybe I'll only develop the bicycle instead of the car. But in that statement, you actually restricted that instructional designer from the opportunity to grow themselves and deliver more of what that client may have wanted.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's important to give people in general, some autonomy to innovate as well, because you don't know what you don't know at the end of the day.
Exactly.
I think what you just talked about also ties into some of your background on building cultures of continuous learning. I mean, if you can teach these partners some L&D skill sets to run these projects, you're going to be able to impact the business with more learning and more performance solutions ultimately as well.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that I have found by the implementation of the continuous learning and performance improvement mindset is that you wind up creating your own backlog of work. So in past 7 or 8 years, when implementing that particular model, I got to a point where if I had people coming to me requesting work, I already had a backlog of work that my team and I had already generated for ourselves from those business relationships that you were talking about earlier, by constantly being present with that workforce, understanding what challenges were in front of them and identifying learning or development opportunities for them. We were already creating a backlog of work. So you can kind of go back to that leader like we were talking about earlier and say, okay, well, help me understand the priority of this work, considering what we've already got and what it aligns to strategically. So you get to have a much higher level dialogue with the executive leaders or their direct reports with regards to the work that you're now doing, and they now see you as a valuable contributor to the business because they see how busy you are working on important things that align to the overall strategic objective of the organization.
And speaking of all of that, like structurally, what do you think's holding back L&D right now from like true operational efficiency versus how other functions operate? What do you think are some of the biggest operational challenges within L&D today?
I will tell you, and again, just it's my 2 cents worth of opinion, and I'm going to accept my guilt here because I was the guy that helped create this mindset that we're at today. But I think what's holding us back is ourselves with regards to where our mindset is. As long as we continue to focus on the course or the workshop, everybody else is going to think of us in that educational mindset if you deliver courses and workshops. And we never get to what you and I have been talking about of now working from the operational standpoint of how am I delivering learning within that workflow that's now helping to move that performance needle that, again, is aligned to the strategic objectives. So until we start to break down that wall and that mindset with regards to everything's around education in that course or workshop, the one and done, we don't really get to move beyond this. And Brian, I can tell you 2 days ago, I saw somebody post something on LinkedIn about just this exactly. And I've seen this for the last 20 years. We're still having the same dialogue that we had 20 years ago. I can remember being in an Elliott Mazie conference back in Las Vegas back in 2000, and we were talking about this. And here it is, 2022, and we're still talking about this. So 22 years later, and again, I'm guilty, we're still having the same dialogues that we had 22 years ago.
Yeah, I think like the story I shared about how L&D got moved under this SVP of operations. I mean, I'm excited, but I fear for the L&D teams that don't have that business growth mindset. This isn't a one-off. I think it's gonna happen and happen fast, where L&D is moved into operational and performance outcome-driven areas because businesses woke up and said, wait a second, L&D did all of this for us through COVID and saved us. That's pretty strategic to the business. Here I thought they were these educators, right? And so now they've woken up, they've seen the impact that these teams can actually have on the organization. And we just need to move at that same level of urgency and speed as we did during the pandemic, and make that the new norm, right? Because that's where you'll get the performance and that strategic output in that regard. Now, you said something, which was interesting, and I and it's all part of learning. You said you were guilty of being that person back in the day, and sharing that vulnerability. What was the aha moment for you, that tilting point where you said, wait a second, I get this now?
Mm-hmm.
And, it was like a rocket ship for you and your mindset, and, taking that new approach to how you're going to apply these skills you have to running an L&D function.
Absolutely. And I can tell you exactly when it happened. It was March 17th of 2008. So I'm presenting the outcome of this big sales workshop that I just done for the organization that I was working for. So this is first time salespeople, right? It's a 2-week long workshop. We're teaching about our products. We're teaching how to engage with possible clients, how to assess them, whatever else. And so we had just done, Jack and Patty Phillips ROI, certification course, whatever else. So we're feeling good about ourselves. We're walking into the executive team and we're presenting this workshop and we're presenting our results. And the chief financial officer said, prove it. So well, we're talking about these and I'm showing them the numbers, whatever. He goes, no, prove it to me that you had that impact. And you're sitting there with that deer in the headlights look of, I can't. I know that I was part of that solution, but I don't know what impact that sales manager had of that individual. I don't know what part of the team or the culture that had. I don't know about some of the other support functions with regards to that salesperson and what their impact was. And so that for me was that moment of what's happening after they leave my event that now I need to contribute to make sure that what it is that I did actually resulted in their overall performance improvement. And so that's where that shift actually happened for me is that I could only point to that workshop or that course saying, well, yeah, they learned this and they showed me they could learn it. But I never could to make that association from that to how that actually transferred to their performance. And so that's where I started to make that shift was, okay, now let me go out there when they're actually doing this work, understand what kind of challenges and things they're facing, and see what I can do to now support them while they're in their flow of work, whatever that role may be, whatever they may be doing, to provide them the right resources, but also to be able to tell that story back to that CFO. Here's what I saw. Here's what I saw them doing. Here's where I saw that they needed assistance. And here's what we did to actually help them continue moving. And then that became a much better story for that CFO a couple of years later when I told him the new story. And he's like, you proved it to me.
And, a lot of L&D professionals struggle to gather the data to demonstrate or to articulate the impact of learning investments. I mean, what type of data or insights should they be focusing on? Is it the operational data? Is it evaluation data? Is it a combination of two? How do you get to tell the story in a confident way, backed with that evidence, to be able to do what you just described?
It's a combination of what you just talked about. So, of course, there is the operational data because there's some kind of performance metric or metrics that's always associated with that work for that team, for that department, that division. And then, of course, you talk about your evaluation data. So now we're back to that learning practice of, okay, what did they actually learn? How did they now actually apply it? And then kind of surrounding all this, and I've talked about this for a couple of years, is did you tell the entire story? So the idea of now showing how you improve performance is telling that story from beginning to end. Where did we start on this journey? What did we learn? How did we adjust? And how did we continue adjusting to show those little bitty things of performance improvement? And what I found is that when you tell them that story, what you're also actually telling them is things that you've discovered that now produced other learning resources that you may have not even considered at the time that you started that project. More importantly, you may have actually built up a project backlog to go back to that executive team or that division head or whatever it may be and say, and here's what we found that actually is still a gap for you that we would like to address. And you'd be amazed at the kind of wide-eyed response you get from those executives when you're pointing out things that are problematic to them. They're not even aware of at that time that they realize could impact their overall performance.
That makes sense too, and I think if you take that product management mindset and you're consulting with your partner to learn about the problems during that discovery period, you're going to get a lot of juicy information that it's kind of like, have you ever watched that show Undercover Boss? The CEOs go to the front line. Well, partnerships are kind of like that. Work with the partners, discover the problems, and come up with learning solutions to address this that impact that group of learners, but also the business outcomes.
Absolutely.
So, where do you think technology plays a role in all of this? Do you think technology is the answer to start doing this at scale? What are your thought processes on that?
I think technology plays a huge role in all this, and there's still certain things that we're learning, when we think about learning management systems, learning experience platforms, e-learning offering tools, video, all those things. So I think that all these technologies, and now you start talking about, for instance, AI and things like that, how do they all fit into that big scope? And so I found, at least in my experience working with a number of organizations that have some of these technologies in place, is that they help start to tell the story of what's going on from a learning and development perspective. And sometimes that data, as an example, can lead you to a story where you start to uncover what might be a gap that nobody's really talking about. Like for instance, I might see an uptick, I should say, in a certain demand for leadership courses, or I want to understand Agile as an example of that. And so if you have the technology capability within the organization, say for instance with social media, like a tool like Yammer or Slack or something like that, you could start to poll the organization and say, we're seeing this. Is this really a concern? What do people really want to know? And if you're lucky enough, you've got that social learning channels built up enough where you start to get a response that then starts to drive of, hey, we got a real need around this. Let's put something together and start driving this actual learning resource. And again, there's a story you can tell of a lot of people needed to learn this new technology or learn this methodology or whatever it may be. And here's how we responded in real time to actually get something out to them and start moving the needle on their overall understanding and performance of the use of this.
Because we're talking about storytelling, I don't know if you've ever read the book by Peter Guber called Tell to Win, Connect, Persuade, and Triumph with Hidden Powers of Storytelling. It's one of my favorite books. I probably brought it up on a previous episode, but really would recommend that to obviously the audience if they're interested in learning how to tell stories, to around this stuff. Joe, are there any books that you would recommend for the audience to read, or anything that they should follow that will help them along their journey when it comes to learning operations, or LearnOps as we call it?
Yeah. So there's a great book I'm reading right now by Dr. John Medina called The Brain Rules for Work. And so he's a PhD in neuroscience, very highly regarded individual. And one of the things that he talks about is that really our understanding of learning is barely scratching the surface, that we really just don't know how people actually learn. So what he talks about is how, from a neurological understanding, is that most people learn when they're actually working. Now he kind of went back to our earliest days of civilization. He goes, most people learn in an unstable environment where there's all kinds of weather going on, and you're trying to survive. But in that same mindset is, okay, we're not out hunting and gathering right now, but we are trying to survive because we want to do a great job. We want to earn a paycheck. We want that nice roof over our head and clothes on our back. And so the mindset's really still the same as how are we now helping people in this unstable environment survive and continue to grow and flourish. And then another book that I'm reading is by Dr. Adam Grant. And so he's become very popular in the past couple of years, and it's called Think Again. And what he talks about, and certainly Ryan, you and I talked about this earlier, And it's this idea of we have to unlearn and relearn everything that we've thought before with this changing environment that we now live in. And I think that that is so important right now because, again, as you talked about with that growth mindset, if you're walking around with a fixed mindset, you're not really growing yourself and you're not really helping your organization if they're moving forward and you're stuck in using practices, methodologies, deliverables of the past.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense too. I always say outcomes first. You should
Outcomes first.
think about the outcome, work backwards, right?
Exactly.
And it's a lot less stressful actually when you think
it
like
sure
that.
is. When you know what that end of the road looks like, it's a lot
line,
easier
exactly.
to get there.
Clear line of sight.
Yep.
Well, I really appreciate this conversation, Joe. Before we hop off, is there any tips or tricks or last comments that you would recommend to the audience today about things that we've discussed?
Absolutely. And it's actually my elevator speech, my analogy that I've been given for the last 7 years when we talk about continuous learning, performance improvement. And I have found that when I talk to executives, CEOs, and other people at higher level positions, when I give this analogy, there is that aha light bulb moment for them when I explain it. And because I live in Wisconsin, I tie this analogy into the Green Bay Packers. But you can choose your sports team; doesn't matter. And it's this idea of if we think of the one and done, if we think of a course or a workshop, that's the equivalent of preseason, right? We're learning our basic skills, we're doing some practicing, we're getting ready for the season. What happens now that the season's underway? Do we think that we're going to win the championship just off the preseason? And most leaders that I've talked to have a pause moment and they go, well, no. Okay, then why would that course or that workshop be where we stop? We need to have continuous learning improvement because your business is changing, priorities change. Again, things with COVID before that, you were on one path, COVID hits, now we're on a different path. How are we now adapting to that? That's where continuous learning and performance improvement is. It's just much like that sports-minded team. Is each week we're getting ready. We're understanding what's in front of us, what we need to do now to provide the right resources and support for your team to continue to move forward in order to win that championship.
All said.
Thank you.
I like that.
I've had a lot of years working on that one.
It's good. Practice makes perfect. But
exactly.
To your point, you're always going to iterate on it. Well, thank you so much for spending the time with us today. This was really insightful. I'm really excited to get this interview to our audience and share your wisdom and expertise with everybody.
Ryan, thank you so much for helping me, and thank you to Cognota as well for reaching out to me and having this opportunity.
Thanks for watching the LearnOps Leadership Series. For more episodes like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And visit us at Cognota.com. That's COGNOTA.com.